Welcome everyone to our first session today of the Oklahoma Library Association Virtual Conference. With us today are Kalantha Tillotson and Shelby Pletcher, who will be presenting Two Designers Walk Into a Bar, Crafting Information Literacy Tutorials through Instructional and Graphic Design Collaboration. Go ahead and take it away.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining. I know it's been a very interesting switchover transition for everybody, but I'm so happy that I'll get to hear from y'all. Please do, as Jody said, we would love feedback, not only in the survey itself, but any questions that you might have, we will make sure to get those answered, at least definitely at the end of the session. So as Jody mentioned, we are Two Designers Walk Into a Bar. I was like, we're really way too proud of that title, as Shelby will tell you. So I am Kalantha Tillotson. I am the Instructional Services Librarian at East Central University, and this is...
Hello, I'm Shelby Pletcher. I'm the Instructional Services Assistant at East Central University.
Yes, so just to give you kind of a picture of what we were trying to do. So we came at this from two very different, not only backgrounds, but also like kind of expectations of what we wanted this project to be. So I actually recruited the wonderful Shelby directly from one of the classes that I teach, because I'm the liaison for one of the, for the English and Languages department, and she was getting a degree in that. And I was just in one of the classes and I was like, hey, anybody want to come work for me and do graphic design? And she came up afterwards and I was like, yeah, this is gonna work. So after we did that, we kind of sat down and this is what I wanted out of this project. So I needed to update the format and design of this huge batch of current tutorials that have been built by my predecessor. So they were on the topics of academic integrity. As we all know, that's one of the big things that libraries are at the forefront of across different university campuses, different library resources that we needed to highlight, and then also just basic information literacy concepts. So these were actually built through a grant. I can't remember the title of it because it was before my time, but the grant actually ended. It was a collaboration between different regional universities across Oklahoma, and then they each kind of took a batch and created a bit of these tutorials, and then they were all housed together so that anybody could kind of take them and embed them as they saw fit. So I came in 2016. May of 2016. That grant had actually ended just the year before. And then that was one of the big projects that I was handed when I first started. And so I needed to start that redesign almost immediately. But as you can see, I waited until 2017 because I had to figure out how to do my job first. And then I actually had to recruit and find someone to come work for me to do the graphic design portion of this. And so actually, it's not a surprise to Shelby, but Shelby wasn't my first graphic designer. And that's something that we'll talk about kind of if you do transition between different graphic designers, kind of some things to be thinking about. But I actually started with another student that I had recruited to come work for me in 2017, and she kind of handled the big first batch of academic integrity because those were our most used tutorials. And then she ended up getting a job across campus at the Writing Center. I'm still grieving the loss a little bit, but I found Shelby, which was awesome. And so then she had the rest, like the vast majority of the tutorials to go ahead and redesign. And so there was actually a LibGuide that was built, and this is where they were kind of housed. And the reason why this is important, because we had to figure out how to remap everything as a part of this project. But then they were originally built in Adobe Captivate. And one of the great things about that was they were actually, part of the grant was giving access not only to the Adobe Captivate software, but then also access to all of these learning materials to figure out how do you actually use Adobe Captivate. And then I came in and I was like, I don't even know what this is. Like, I've never used this before, and I didn't have access to any of those learning materials anymore. So the maintenance was very difficult. So that was part of this switchover, was figuring out, well, what is a software that we can use that will be user-friendly, that will be sustainable, but also will allow me to kind of know what I'm talking about a little bit. And so the library at ECU had actually recently purchased all of SpringShare, and that included LibWizard. So we decided to go with that route. But I really wanted to emphasize visual appeal, interactivity, and accessibility, because all of those things were something that I knew as a student were very important to me, but then also as a librarian, I wanted these to be usable, but I also wanted them to be inviting. And that was something where I knew I needed graphic design help in order to do that, because I'm just an amateur, so I needed a professional. But then the other thing is sustainability was very important to me from the very beginning. Because I was coming in after the fact. And so I realized that there were a lot of just like, documentation that I wasn't aware of. Like I didn't know how these were built. I didn't know how to maintain them. And so I wanted to make sure that whoever might take over these tutorials someday will at least have a little bit more of a package to go with them. But the other thing is not just the format itself, but also the design. And then Shelby had some other expectations.
Yeah, so going into this, I really was just fresh out of college. I was actually trying to finish college. So I was really just looking for experience. So my expectations going into this were just to broaden my graphic design skills. Some of the skills that I've learned in this time is instructional design, tutorial building, and academic resource creation. So those might be some keywords you might want to note for any graphic designers you might want to bring on board.
Okay, so before we actually even jumped into rebuilding any of this, we had to do quite a bit of reflection on what we wanted the whole project to look like. And so I kind of took into my area as the assessing the needs. So what software were we going to build? What platform were we going to use, not only to build it, but then also to share it and publish it for the world to see. But then who was going to record the audio? So we knew some of these were going to be videos, some of these were going to be the actual click-through tutorials. So trying to figure out, who was going to be the best person to do that. And that's important because we kind of changed our mind halfway through. But then also, how are we going to, this was a big project. We had a lot of things, a lot of moving parts going at the same time. So figuring out how do we kind of divide up the responsibilities between the content and the design, and also making sure that the quiz elements and the scripts were in the hands of the person who was best able to update them in a user-friendly manner.
Yeah, and then from there, we really had to look at creating a plan. So first, this looked like what can and should remain the same from past designs and tutorials, and where should the tutorials be embedded online? What's the timeline look like? So there were just like a varying degree of factors that we kind of had to look into going into this.
So there's a lot of steps here, but we wanted to be specific so that hopefully this could be something that could be replicated if any of you decide that you want to do a project like this. Some of these will depend on, so for example, keep in mind, most of the tutorials that we were designing, we were redesigning. So we had a lot of the content already. So it was more about editing it than starting from scratch. Now, if anybody has any questions on how this would be adapted, I can tell you a little bit in this slide itself. But we have now gotten to the stage where we are actually creating our own. And so some of these things change slightly. So if you have any questions about that, please let us know. But the very first thing is I realized because this was such a huge project, I needed to have a schedule. I needed to know what were we going to focus on and when. And I also needed to be really clear because we had, there was Shelby and I, and we were kind of the main players in this, but we had a larger group of people who we were getting feedback from consistently. And then I also, of course, had a boss who wanted this to be done in a timely fashion. So just being clear from the very beginning with all of those partners about like what was going to be the timeline, how were we going to actually get this feedback? All of that, I think, was really important to hopefully smooth out the process. Not that there weren't bumps, and we'll be very honest about those, but at least I think starting with those expectations is really important. And then what I would do on a kind of a semesterly basis is I would prioritize the tutorials themselves. So I would say, and I really base this on, so for our annual reports, which are always a joy for both Shelby and I, but for our annual reports every year, we actually gather data on how each of these tutorials are being used. And so I based what we were going to prioritize off of that data, which was actually really helpful. So, the next annual report, I was like, okay, I'm not going to be as upset that we have to gather all this because it's actually useful data. But yeah, so basically I would say, what are the ones that are used most? Because I wanted to make sure that those were updated so that people could access them because I knew that they were going to access them. or at least they were more likely to do that than some of the ones that weren't really used that much. And so that's why we actually started with the academic integrity tutorials, because those are the ones that are actually embedded in a lot of classes themselves. So it's an assignment for their students to complete, as opposed to a lot of the other tutorials that we do embed as within like our course guides and our subject guides and our actual website itself, but it's usually not embedded separately into like Blackboard, for example. So I would do that, and then communication, and this is going to be a kind of a theme for us, is that communication was really key. And so we didn't just meet on a monthly or semesterly basis. Like actually, Shelby and I, we meet weekly. Sometimes it feels like daily, just because we like to just chat, which is a lot harder, now that we can't just stop by each other's desks. But yeah, so we would definitely make sure that we were meeting at least on a monthly basis to just talk about this and update each other on how the progress was going. And then I would kind of hand over the next few steps to Shelby.
Yeah. And so from there, I would literally just look at the tutorial that was already there. So I'd watch the tutorial in Captivate. I'd take my notes down. I would literally type out the whole script, and then Kalantha and I would go over the script and kind of decide, okay, what needs to be taken away, what needs to be added, and what needs to be revised. So especially considering these tutorials were created in like 2010, 2009, a lot of the digital access that students have is so different now. So we had to change a lot of the wording, update a lot of the screenshots, so different things like that you may want to look into. And then from there, we would decide the format of the tutorial. So there were two different formats that we've always looked at, and that's either just embedding a quiz into LibWizard, or just creating a narrated YouTube video type tutorial. So then from there, we would brainstorm the visualization of the script. So that would mean I literally would type out the whole finalized edited script that we decided upon. And then I would literally take notes on that script, just anything that I visualized when reading the paragraphs. I would just write down those ideas that I kind of came up with. And then from there, I would create a list of the visual elements that I needed to create, which was a part of creating a list of tasks based on the software. So there's several different programs that we used in creating the tutorials, but the main one that I used a lot was Adobe Illustrator. Your graphic designer is going to kind of know like more what works for them. But basically the reason that we chose Adobe Illustrator was because I was able to freehand everything that I did. I didn't have to rely on free images anywhere or other created commons images that we could use. I could just create everything from scratch. So I would create all the images in Illustrator and create like a list of the items that I needed to create in Illustrator. And then I would build the slides from there. And then I would end up embedding those slides into LibWizard or Adobe Premiere Pro. Now, Adobe Premiere Pro is the video editing software that we used if we went with a video format. And so if we were going with that, then we also needed to record our audio. And then from there, I would send a draft of the tutorial to Kalantha for comments. I would revise the tutorial from there, and then we would send the tutorial off to our librarians for more comments. And then I would revise the tutorial some more. And then it would get handed off to Kalantha.
So the reason why we laugh about the revision, anybody who's done any kind of design work knows that feedback is valuable. Don't get me wrong. Like the more people, the more voices you have, kind of the richer the final, product, whatever it is that you're creating. But it was something where you always have to balance your timeline with the amount of feedback that you want to get. And so that was something that we really had to learn you also tend to, I know if you're anybody who does have to do creative work, you tend to get a little emotionally attached to whatever the product is. And so sometimes when you get feedback, you might have those moments where it's very overwhelming and I know even and I wasn't even the one, like this was everything that we created was collaboratively built between Shelby and I. So it wasn't just my baby, but I would still have those moments when I'm like, hey, back off, guys. Like, we worked hard on this. Come on. But I mean, none of our coworkers didn't take that into account. Like, and we had to take a step back and remember, like, they didn't know. They weren't there from the beginning. They don't know how many like days and weeks and months of blood, sweat, and tears went into each of these tutorials. And so, again, make sure that you are getting feedback. And I think making sure that we were getting that feedback in an iterative way. And so actually, we say that I would give comments and then we would send it to the librarians. But a lot of the times what would happen is I would give comments, we would revise, we would send it to the librarians, we would revise, we would send it back to the librarians, and we would revise. Then we would send it to the direction of the library, and then we would revise. And sometimes we would even pilot it with a group of students that we had working for us at the time, and then we would revise. So there's a lot of revision that takes place, and you have to kind of build that into your timeline. And so there was plenty of moments when I was like, we just got to get it done. Like, we have so many tutorials to do, and we had such a short amount of time. And so there were a couple of times when I'm like, well, and you also have to realize that just because somebody gives you that feedback doesn't mean that that's the right thing to change. Like, it's a lot of feedback on design work is very it's subjective. Like, there are those rules that we try to follow. So obviously, if it's something to do with accessibility or something like that, we want to make sure that we're doing the best that we possibly can. But a lot of it is also, I know some of us, it would be like, I like this blue, but not that blue, which, can be good, but also realizing that even our attachment to specific like fonts or specific colors that we chose it's a personal choice. It's not necessarily the universally best choice. So again, I know I went off on a little bit of a tangent, but just keep that in mind, that the revision and the feedback loop is going to take time. So then what we would do is, once I had gotten feedback from all of our partners, I would finalize, and then I would update whatever that box was. So we actually had, I'm not going to get too convoluted here, but there were basically 3 different locations that we would have to update it. So we would have the page that was built for the grant itself, that we kept that going because we weren't sure when we needed to go ahead and just mesh all of that into our own tutorials webpage. And then we also had this reusable content, which is what we use to embed in different boxes, different resources in all of our subject guides and our course guides and topic guides. So I went ahead and I would have to update that particular box. And so then once that was all done and it was mapped to the right place, although sometimes that would get convoluted, I would go ahead and with Shelby, we would repeat steps 5. So we would repeat creating the scripts, all the way to finalizing and updating it in LibGuides for each of the separate tutorials. And then on a semesterly basis, I would update the redesigned schedule. I would kind of reprioritize what the tutorials, what we were going to focus on for the next semester. And then I would inform the library director of progress. And I know, it might not be something where your boss is as hands-on, but this was something that was really important to Dana Belcher, my director. And so I wanted to make sure that she was in the loop, not only to give feedback while we were creating it, but then also to understand, I'm not just saying that we're getting stuff done, but we are getting stuff done. So I wanted to make sure that she knew that from semester to semester. Okay, so Shelby, what did we make?
Okay, so the results of our progress in the last couple of years has been, so in the academic year of 2017 and 2018, the student before me created 7 academic integrity tutorials. And then when I came along in the summer of 2018, in that academic year, we created 4 in the summer, we created 5 in the fall, and 3 in the spring. And that also includes 3 that we alternatively gathered. So for instance, we had one on choosing a topic from OSU's library, and we decided that it would actually be best, instead of just creating our own tutorial, theirs was, sufficient enough. So we added it to our LibGuide. And then we deleted 7 tutorials. Now, this doesn't mean that we got rid of that information entirely. This just means that there were a lot of tutorials that were, couple minutes long or just like a quick little few slides that just weren't necessary to have a tutorial on their own. So we ended up folding that information over into other tutorials that were created or other infographics on our website. And then in the academic year of 2019 and 2020, we started building our own tutorials, and this included the media literacy tutorial and infographic and our library terminology infographic. And then from there, we also had other departments create some tutorials. So for instance, like public services created a data visualization tutorial. So this is kind of a good idea for you to all to have. You might have other departments that might be interested in creating tutorials or already have really great information gathered and great resources gathered that you could kind of pull in. So it could be a collaborative library project.
Yeah, so as every librarian has heard this at one point and probably said this at one point or another, but don't reinvent the wheel. Like it's unnecessary for us to like create, because it's hard work, and it's time taxing to create these from scratch. And so it's so lovely, and we love to share as librarians. So it was so wonderful to be able to look out into the great wide world of libraries and find other tutorials that really were beautiful, and they were very user friendly, very accessible. And so we didn't need to start from scratch with that particular topic. And as Shelby mentioned, the other thing to keep in mind is, yes, in our case, we are over the tutorials because we're the instructional services department in the library, but that doesn't mean that we're best suited to create a tutorial on all topics. So for example, we have media services department, and they kind of oversee a lot of the creation and the printing of research posters across campus. And so we actually went to them and we asked them to create a separate research poster tutorial that kind of walks people through some of the best practices for creating that kind of visualization. But then also we have the data visualization. So this came about because we were kind of getting, it wasn't formalized, but we were getting sort of feedback, informal feedback from different faculty members across campus, different students. And we had one faculty member in particular who said, hey, like data visualization, like this is something that's really important for my area. Could this be something that you could create to be shared across campus? And so, Shelby and I were like, we kind of know about data visualization. We're like, well, I don't know. And we brought it up in the instructional services committee that includes all the other librarians. And that's when I found out that my colleague, who's the public services librarian, was like, hey, she's a liaison for the education department. She had already built a course-specific tutorial for an education class, and she was like, I can just expand this, and it can be something that we can embed for all areas. And so that's what I mean. Like, you have a lot of talent, not only within your department, but across the library and really across campus. This is a great thing to collaborate with on specific faculty members. And so, for example, the media literacy, that was something that came about because this was not only an emphasis for myself, but it was an emphasis for my area. I'm the liaison for the English and Languages department. So this is something that they are, of course, very passionate about. So it was really lovely to be able to kind of get their feedback on that in particular. So again, just keep in mind, you're not alone. There are so many talented people around you. It's just finding the right people. Okay, and then this is an example. Shelby, walk us through. What is this?
Yeah, so this is the landing page for our tutorials. This kind of just gives you an idea of how we kind of looked at this project. So as you can see, each LibGuide box is kind of put in its own category. And when you click into that box, it gives you a list of tutorials based on that subject. And this landing page also gives you a good idea of how we kind of approached the design aspect of our tutorials. So we wanted to keep it simple, but we also wanted it to be colorful and inviting. And then also, if you notice the avatars at the top, those were actually something that the student before me, Taylor, she actually originated. And then I kind of came on board and just revised them and made them my own, kind of design. So it matched everything that I was creating. And this is just kind of a great face. Calantha can probably touch more on this, but
Yes, so this was actually it was something that I was so excited about. I've just always wanted to have a cartoon version of myself, I think. So when I had my last student, the first student, we were talking about how are we going to have students not only relate to the librarian, so this was like another way to have our faces out there, but then also to use us as a symbol of an expert who can guide the students through that particular tutorial. So we started with the academic integrity tutorials. So it started with me. So she created one for me. And then as we were going through, we had 7 tutorials, and we only have 6 librarians, but it was great because then I just got 2. So I was really excited. But then also what was really fun is that when it started with me, and then I asked permission for the other tutorials. I said, hey, we really like this concept. Would you be up for letting us use your image to guide students through this particular tutorial? And it just started with 1 and 2. And then once they had that, then the other ones got a little jealous and they were like, hey, I want one for me too. So it was really great. And I've actually noticed, and the director itself, she was very excited too to be included. And she's actually the one that we use for guiding the faculty through, because she's kind of one up. She's an administrator, so one up on the hierarchy. And so what was really cool is this is actually expanded. So having these images, not only are we using them kind of in our own like personal, not personal, but professional sort of situations and communications with different faculty or different students, but this has been embedded in a lot of our marketing across the library. And so you will just see our avatars, our faces on different posters across campus. And I think that is really cool. So I highly recommend that if you do find don't try to do it yourself, unless you are someone who has graphic design experience. But if I had tried this, it would have been stick figures. So once you have a graphic designer, use them for things like this, and think about how can this not only, like as librarians, we always want people to get more familiar with us. So how can this be used even beyond a specific tutorial? Okay, so now that we've kind of gone through and updated all of the big batch that we had to do, and we've started creating new ones, we really wanted to think through what are some things that we need to do to make this sustainable, to make all of these things that we're building continue to be relevant. And so on my end, a lot of that is gathering feedback from all of our stakeholders. Again, like I mentioned before, we are doing a lot of this informally, but we haven't actually started where we are sending out and actually asking people specifically about the tutorials. We'll ask them about, like the instruction sessions overall, or different, research consultations or different tools that we have. So that's something that we're going to need to formalize a little bit more. But basically, what are the gaps? That's the main thing. So is this usable content for our librarians? So our librarians, everybody but the director at our institution actually is also a liaison, which means they do teach information literacy sessions, whether or not there's someone who was specifically excited about instruction like I was. So we need to make sure that this is something that they're actually being embedded. And there were a few, not all of them, like the tutorials before were really useful, even if they weren't as sustainable. And so they were being embedded, but not all of them were, and they weren't being used equally. And so making sure, if we had a couple tutorials that had 0, maps. So, I mean, if they're not being like actually getting to the students and the faculty, then that's a big red flag. Like that means that the librarians didn't really find this useful. The other thing is it useful for the course guides and subject guides for the faculty members themselves? So are these things that they have noticed that they want to kind of point their students towards? Because again, if you just, putting them in the course guides and the subject guides, that is getting them one step further, one step closer to the students. Because if it's not required, they're not going to just go to the tutorial page on their own. Mostly, like you need to make sure that it is embedded around a particular assignment or a particular course. But it's still going to be something that you need faculty support on. You need faculty to say, hey, this is something I think you all need to take. Even if they don't make it an actual assignment, if they just mention that in a class, that goes a long way with not all students, but a lot of students. The other thing is, do the students themselves themselves find this content valuable, and not just for that particular course, but for their academic career overall. And I mean, I think that's the other thing is because these are really just, some of this information is basic, but like media literacy, for example, like in the tutorial itself, this could be something that could be relevant at every single level of a student's career. And so making sure that it is something that kind of grows with them. And they do have access to it, but they also actually look through it. They do take the tutorial and they learn something from it. So that's something that we haven't really added any kind of feedback loop within the tutorials themselves for students to just say, hey, what was your experience, kind of thing. But that's something that we definitely have on our radar to do in the future. The other thing is, does it cover the knowledge base necessary for research? So does it go beyond, like, for example, media literacy? That's not something that's typically in that kind of cycle of research. I mean, it's something that we talk about, but it's not something that we necessarily thought would need to be included. But thanks to really Uncoiled, when we were talking about info environmentalism, so shout out to Mike Caulfield and OSU for getting me, kind of directing me towards that. That's really where I was like, hey, this is a very valuable, necessary skill for students to have. Let's go ahead and just create, instead of me just doing course specific stuff, which is what I was doing, let's create something that can be embedded across the board. And the same is true for data visualization. I can't think of another one that we've done so far, but we will definitely keep that in mind for the future. So what are things that we've identified and how can we best fit that need?
Yeah. And then from there, we kind of are looking at maintenance. So some of these steps, you'll notice like the green check mark next to them. That means that we've either already completed this or we're in the process of completing it. So these are just some ideas of maintenance that might help you. So first we had creating a media creation policy and permissions. So this kind of came out of a weird situation where in the transfer between me and the past designer, she very kindly and graciously came to us and asked that we not use her name on any future tutorials, and that we not use any of her images and recreate them, where that's kind of something that is pretty normal in design houses. So I didn't really have any experience with anyone having an issue with that. And obviously neither did Calantha. So that kind of made us realize, okay, we really need to create something that people need to sign that says, okay, this is what this design is owned to, etc. So that might be something that you really want to look into. From there, it's creating a tutorial plan and maintenance schedule, as Calantha already touched on in the middle steps portion. And then synthesizing our guides. So Calantha already kind of talked about this, but so the grant was its own guide in our situation, and then we kind of had to build our own tutorial page. And so I just recently kind of went through and got rid of that old grant page, made sure everything was remapped to our tutorial pages. So we only had one landing page for our tutorials and then a reusable content page for LibGuide building. So then from there, it's, like I said, redesigning the tutorial guide. That's something that I just looked at a couple of months ago, and that was part of the landing page that you saw. And then we kind of reorganized all of our tutorials to make sure that they all kind of fit together instead of just using the organization that was there before from the grant. We've also updated our closed captions on our videos to be in compliance with ADA guidelines. We've embedded, well, we are currently embedding Creative Commons into all of our tutorials. And then in the future, we really want to look at updating academic integrity tutorials to fit school guidelines as they fluctuate. Since our redesign was so recent, we actually have not run into this, but this might be something that you want to look into at your own university, or we are just kind of keeping this on the back burner for the future. We've also looked at creating documentation for tutorial building standards. I've already started this for our future staff members, but it's just not completed yet. Basically what this looks like is, what is the person after me? What is the person after Calantha? How are they going to approach tutorial building? What information can I share with them? I'm sure you all are pretty familiar with documentation. So that basic kind of process. We've also really looked into re-recording our audio. So as it turns out, I really don't like being in front of a microphone. And so all of our tutorials at the beginning, I was my own production person. I was a one-man show. So in the future, I think it would be best, and we've already kind of started this, to make Calantha, who is actually an instructor and actually skilled at, talking, to do our narrated videos. So that might be something you want to look into, is who do you want to be the voice of these videos? You don't want to just be anybody. And then lastly, creating new tutorials based on the identified gaps, which is, what Calantha already touched on. So that's just something that we're constantly keeping in the forefront of our mind.
Yes, and just a couple things. So as Shelby mentioned with the media creation policy, it's, again, I never worked with a graphic designer before, and then I was having to transition between two. And so I didn't even think about the fact that, like, who is going to have ownership of all of these things that were created. And so I think that it's really important, if you've never worked with a graphic designer before, don't make the mistake I did. Again, it was resolved, and it wasn't like a huge deal, but it was something that I was like, hey, I didn't even think about the fact that, she is going to be using them. We're going to not only be reusing them, but adapting them. And so that's an extra level of kind of copyright. And so between us, of course, we're going into it knowing that this is going to be Creative Commons, whatever we create. So that has helped us, but we didn't think about that from the very beginning. The other thing is, you might find out that you really like to talk into a microphone. That's what I discovered. It was just Shelby and I in this janky little room that nobody used in the library, and I'd just be repeating words over and over again, and she'd be like, no, there's a catch. She was like my producer, and I loved being produced too. So there we go. You might learn something new about yourself. Now I just need to make a podcast, apparently. So So we learned a lot. I think that's the main thing. We learned so much. For me, graphic design is magical. Like, I just never worked directly with a graphic designer before. I knew that it made things beautiful. I knew that there was a lot of talent there and that it was artistic, but I had never had to do it. I'd never really worked that closely with someone. The other thing is sharing is caring. So not only when it comes to copyright, like making sure that everyone involved in the project is aware of what kind of copyright you want to use, but then also making sure that you're constantly in feedback. Like, not only with people who are going to be, like, it's iterative, any kind of design project should be, but also with the direct, collaborative partners, that you are making sure that everybody is aware of what you've accomplished, what you're going to plan on doing, when do you need to loop somebody in to kind of help brainstorm. The other thing is, from the very beginning, think about sustainability. Think about the fact that you're not going to exist forever. And so who are the people you don't know who the people are who are going to be taking over this particular project, but then also, how are you going to make their lives easier so that if they do have to maintain these or update them in some way, that it's not a mountainous task for them.
And then for me, I also learned a lot just as a graphic designer. So first of all, creating step-by-step lists helped me so much from being overwhelmed by all these extensive projects. Obviously, coming out of school, I'd never really done big projects like this, let alone by myself. So just having some outlet that helped me get over the fact that I couldn't riff off, my peers anymore. I was the only designer, or graphic designer rather, working on these projects. So if I got designer block, I had to find a way to work around that. I couldn't just always talk through it with someone. Another thing that I really learned was processing cross-discipline feedback with patience. So as I already mentioned, like, I was the only graphic designer working on these things. So even though the librarians had instructional design work, we were speaking two different languages a lot of the time. And so there was a lot of instances where it was really hard for me not to become really personal about the feedback that I would get. And just my pride would kick in, and I'd start to think, well, I'm the one with the graphic design degree, So just realizing that just because someone doesn't have a specific discipline in their past doesn't mean that they don't have helpful things to say, and vice versa. So another thing that I learned, I was in a weird position where I'm also the instructional services assistant. So I get to be in the instructional services committee meetings. So I got to learn a lot about instructional design, even though I still have a ways to go. And that kind of helped me compare it to the general design techniques and standards that I've always learned. So yeah, that might be something you want to look into going into it. I know Calantha and I have talked about, we kind of wish that we had sat down in the past day one and said, okay, comparison, instructional design to the general graphic design standards that you know. So yeah.
Okay, so just to fly through these for a second, I just wanted to give some, as a librarian, and this was my first experience working with graphic designers, I wanted to make sure that speaking to other librarians, here are some best practices. Here are some things that I learned. The first thing is graphic designers aren't artists. That is a completely different mindset in some cases. I mean, not that there's not a lot of creativity and artistry in librarianship itself, but make sure that you allow them space to think and to be creative, whether that be physical or whether that be mental, emotional, whatever it is. But clarify that ownership. Trust them to get stuff done, but don't smother them. Don't be a micromanager. Be humble and willing to show ignorance. That really helped us learn to learn from each other. Mentor, don't just use them and lose them for this particular project, and be realistic about your timeline, because we had to get stuff done and we needed to be aware of how much we could accomplish from month to month. It really ended up being like one tutorial a month, but that didn't always work. So I don't think I saw any questions per se in the chat, unless Jody found something, but here's our contact information. So please feel free. A lot of these documentations and other things are in flux, so we're working on them. But if you would like copies of any of that, or if you are working on updating a tutorial and you want to just check, just talk to us and brainstorm about it, please let us know. We would be more than happy to do that. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Calantha and Shelby. And again, if you have any questions, we have 5 minutes, so plenty of time to ask our speakers any questions. Looks like we have one from Jay. Have you been able to incorporate the ACRL framework, authority as constructed and contextual, information creation as process, into the tutorials?
That is a really good question, Jay. So I think that this is something that we were thinking about while we were redesigning, but a lot of that is being embedded more in the new tutorials that we were creating, because we were basing what we were redesigning off of what had been created before. So that is something that we need to keep in mind to make sure that we are including all of those concepts, because that's something we're trying to do overall with our instruction program.
Kathy has a question. What closed caption software did you use?
So actually, we never created or used a specific closed caption software. We were kind of looking into that in the future to make things a lot easier. But actually, if you upload your videos to YouTube, which is the platform that we decided to use for any of our narrated tutorials, there's actually a closed captioning option on there, and it'll kind of create a script for you, but it's really like no grammar, like anything like that. So I would just go through and edit and make sure that everything was spelled correctly and everything was narrated correctly. So that's a pretty easy tool that you can use in YouTube Studio.
Yeah, and like she said, I saw Kathy on there saying it's pretty rough. It is. It's rough. It's only about 60-70% correct, and has no punctuation. So just make sure you build that into your steps, that you have somebody going back through. And that's a good thing to have a student do.
Tina asks, with so many of us having to convert our school libraries for distance learning, do you have any advice?
Oh man, that's a tough one.
Question.
Oh my gosh. I would say that this was perfect timing for us. No, nothing about this is perfect. I just mean in the sense that we had already worked so hard to create this suite of online resources. And so these have been really valuable. And we've been able to point, now that we at ECU, we've been, in this, like, trying to help our faculty do blended learning or all online to make that transition. And so now we do have these things that you can, they can embed in Blackboard themselves if they want to. And so that has been good. That's been really helpful, and they're Creative Commons. So I guess my advice would be, Tina, you can use stuff that we created. But yeah, it's tough. I think the main advice, because it's very overwhelming for me, because a lot lot of this stuff that you're having to do is design work. And so I think the main advice that I would give is be patient with yourself, and realize that this is hard work. I would have a lot of moments when I would be like, I should be better at this. And then sweet Shelby would be like, oh, it's tough because it's creative work. So it's easy to get burnt out by this, because it takes so much of your mental space. And so I think also keep in mind, if you can collaborate with other people, not only to use the resources that they're creating, but also to kind of help, with that brainstorming. Yeah, a short timeline, right? Yeah, I mean, I totally understand. Our faculty, the ones that haven't been working over the summer, are going to be calling on us on Monday, and they're going to have like 2 weeks to get everything ready for their classes. So yeah, I think when I was saying patient, more be patient with your, like, whatever emotional reaction that you might have to it. And give yourself, just like we're learning about working from home or any of these other routines, give yourself, little breaks in between so that you don't get burnt out. Take 5 minutes to just kind of refresh your brain before you have to jump into more creative work. And also don't start from scratch. So like I said, there's a lot of stuff out there that other people have created. So, use us. Shelby, do you have anything to add?
No, sounds good to me.
Big Shelby.
Right. We have less than a minute. Any last few second questions for our speakers? Just a reminder to please fill out the evaluation form for this session. I'm going to post the link again in the chat box, as well as so that's the link for the evaluation form, and then for the auction.
Yes, please. We would love to get any feedback. We want to be the best possible versions of ourselves.
All right, and then here's the link for the auction. All right. Again, if you have any questions for our speakers, their contact information is on the screen right now. Feel free to shoot them an email or give them a call. I have 10:45, so we'll go ahead and call it a day. Let's give Calantha and Shelby a virtual round of applause, and we will see you for our next session, Project Management for the Unofficial Library Project Manager by Elizabeth Skurspan. Thank you, everyone, for attending today, and we will see you at the next session.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.